Thank you, Mark, and hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening to myself. I'm very, very happy to be here with you, excited to share with you one of the latest things that I've been busy with. And without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to see the presentation. Just 1 second. I'm going to put this full screen. Okay. Just raise your hand. Can you see it? Is it okay? Okay, great. So we're going to talk today, dedicate the next 40 or 50 minutes to this sculpture, The Sacrifice of Isaac. And as Mark explained in the beginning, this sculpture went a 2-year, even more, nearly 4-year undergo project. So it's first of all, physically, it's a big sculpture. The base of the sculpture is more than 10 feet wide. And you'll see why that caused some very difficult problems also in conservation later on. And before we begin, I'll give you a bit of an introduction about what happened, how I found the sculpture, and also a bit about George Segal before we'll dive into this specific sculpture. So I presume that you all recognize Segal's his handmark, and those are the white plaster sculptures. I just want to take, before we start, I just want to take a moment to recognize where the sculpture is and where I work for the past 10 years, but recently, this is a recent picture of the square or the area just before the museum. The museum you see in the background, and beforehand is what today is called the Hostage Square. And we every day have many, many visitors. It's a place where the families of the hostages hang out. And it's where people come to meet them, come to show support. And there's a lot of happening. People come and bring their own, let's say, tokens of participation. So that's what you see here in the front, the carpet of hope. And that's a few months ago already, and now it's a bit changed. And this is part of what today the Tel Aviv Museum is participating in. It's part of our everyday life. I also want you to take a moment and see what's on the right side of the screen of this slide. Is there a beginning of a sculpture? You can see a head, right? It's like a circle, and there's a head, 2 eyes and a nose. And that's the beginning of the sculpture of Kadishman that we are going to talk about later on. I just wanted to locate you so you know where we are, and also to address the fact that this presentation I'm dedicating to the release of the hostages, which is going to be, it's all the time on our minds, particularly when we talk about these themes today, and you'll see how they relate and how much it's also relevant to today. So this is the sculpture that we just saw the head of, and this is Kadishman sculpture, which is also called The Sacrifice of Isaac. And this sculpture is located on this terrace before the museum. He created this sculpture in 1982. And later on, we're going to discover what's the connection between the two sacrifices and how much it influenced actually Israeli art. Before we head on, this is a recent picture of the sculpture when it was exhibited in the opening of the exhibition in September 2023, okay? Just before the break of the 7th of October. And this exhibition was part of a few other exhibits that we had related to 50 years of the Yom Kippur War. And George Segal created this sculpture itself when? In 1973. So there's a lot of links that are going to happen from 1973 till today. And we're going to try to tie them all together. I photographed somebody next to the sculpture in order so also you can see the proportions, the size. It's nearly a life-size sculpture, and it's definitely a large sculpture. it is on the floor. It's not on a special pedestal. And of course, it's all white and it's all made out of plastic. But this is how I found this sculpture in 2017. Underneath in the storage facilities of the museum. The museum is huge, and underneath the museum floors, we have 2 levels of storage because we only exhibit maybe 2% of all of the collection. And when I did a tour in the storage area, because we were considering undergoing a whole renovation of this area, I found this sculpture and immediately I recognized it. I knew what it was, even though, as you see, it's covered, it's in a few broken into a few different pieces. But once you see a Segal sculpture, you know what it is, right? You can recognize it. And this is how our museum storage used to look. Today, it's totally different and much more organized, but there's a lot of different things happening. You have to take out works, bring in works, they wrap them up. Like it's an ongoing procedure happening all the time with the artworks, and sometimes they were harmed. And especially when this is a very delicate material, we're talking about plaster, it's not a long-term, it does not hold for very long if it's not treated correctly. Once I saw the sculpture and how it was broken up into different pieces, I went into some sort of research, but the only photograph of the sculpture, the documentation that I could see of this sculpture, which I knew was important, which I knew that I learned about, was this black and white photograph. And I understood that not only is it so important to create a project, to make a project of this, and to renovate the sculpture in order for people to see, I knew also that it's an important piece that needs to be documented, that needs to be exhibited, that needs to be part of the art language and the art field, also relevant today in 2024. At the time was 2017. So I had this urge that I wanted to create the budget, the space, and also have to understand the importance of the sculpture in order to receive all of the things that I wanted it to happen with it. Now, before we move on further with this sculpture and further how the renovation went, I feel like we need to backtrack a little bit. In order to talk about the sacrifice of Isaac, we need to first go back to the story itself, to the text, the simple text from Genesis, which we read twice a year, only twice a year, right? We read it when it's the parasha, when it comes up in the order of the reading of the Torah on Shabbat. And also there's one more time when it comes up, when we read it in front of the whole congregation. I'm giving you a minute. Yes, when is that? On Yom Kippur, right? So this, Rosh Hashanah, sorry, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, this is what we read. And it's interesting because when I think about it, it's it's a difficult story, right? It's not a story that we really want to bring up our kids about, you know, that that Abraham nearly sacrificed his own son. And when I was a young child, and I think it's still like the tradition, why do we read it on Rosh Hashanah? Because we talked when we blow the shofar, so that is the horn of the ram. And this is where the ram appears for the first time. I also want to, of course, there's a further thought about it, and it shows how much that Abraham trusted God in order that he was willing to sacrifice his own son. Now, when we read this paragraph, we see that there's a few, as an artist, right? If an artist would start reading this paragraph, he has all of the back story and about Abraham and the anticipation of the young child, you know, when he's asking his father, Where is here are the firestones and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? So we have all of that, but also we have some more physical, more technical hints that can help us create this story. And those are the ones that I highlighted in yellow. We have the appearance of wood. We have an altar. There's a knife. There's a motion of Abraham raising his hand, an angel, and of course, in the end, there's the ram. So many artists before Segal were attracted to the story. And of course, one of the leading ones is Caravaggio, and he did this several times. And I'm just for reference, would like to show you a few of these, because this is how the different artists use, and we can see the difference, used to use these different elements in their story. So in all of the paintings of the sacrifice of Isaac, we will always see that there's going to be a father and son, right? The players of the story. There'll be wood, right, for the offering. There's going to be an altar. There's going to be a knife. Abraham is holding a knife, a ram, and of course an angel, which I didn't add here. Now here we see Caravaggio really tried to bring out the characters, and the background is totally dark. It's out of context, right? And it's lit, as he does, usually in a very dramatic way. If you squint your eyes a little bit, you can already see what are the highlights of a painting, because those are the ones that are most lit up. And we can see here that the light is falling on the angel's face, on the ram, and a little bit on the shoulder and the top of the head of Abraham. So it's very, very dramatic. But within this drama, the drama is happening between Abraham and the angel. Okay, they're looking to each other in their in their eyes, and something is happening between them. It's interesting to see that here Caravaggio, the young boy, young Isaac, is looking back at the angel. Later on, he does this scene again, and we see that it's very different. First of all, we have a background, we have a context. We do have all of the elements, the knife, the ram, the angel, the altar, all those things happen. But also there's a great motion. There's a whole diagonal happening from the angel into all the way to Isaac. But the most thing that we are very, very attracted to is the end of the diagonal, is this face, this horrid face that is not looking back this time at the angel and his father, Abraham, but he's looking back at us, at the viewer. How could this happen? How could my father sacrifice me? Okay, so it's a very direct, very strong and powerful painting. By the way, as a side note, if you recognize, you see that the angel and Isaac are very similar. And it's supposedly the same model used for both of them. Just one more, and that's an example of Rembrandt, how he portrayed this story. And this is even more fantastic, because in Rembrandt's sacrifice of Isaac, we see something very powerful, that Abraham does not want his own son to see what is happening, does not want his own son to see that he is going to slaughter him. So he covers up his face. And the dramatic moment here, we see the ram does not appear because it only happens afterwards. First, the angel comes and he's holding Abraham's hand. And you can see this hand looks pretty large compared to what it's supposed to be. So it's very strong. There's a lot of hands happening here in this painting. And also the light is very powerful and dramatic. And also just to remember that this is part of the story that has been told in many, many, of the Old Testament. First, we can see this Sarah, Abraham offering the three angels, and it's part of the story. We can see it even, in the 6th century where in one of these churches that we see that Abraham is here and Isaac is kneeling on the slaughter. So it's in the context when George Segal comes to create this sculpture, he has seen all of these examples. And he's also been working on various other biblical stories. So he's immersed in this. But where does he come from? What is his background? So George Segal was born in 1924 to Jewish parents, a Jewish family that immigrated from Eastern Europe a few years beforehand, and they were very hardworking family. And he grew up in a family that did not really encourage him towards art, and that's why we'll see he'll only arrive in a mature age over 30 when he starts to exhibit. His parents themselves were owned a kosher butcher in the Bronx. And this is one of his early works that he created after his father died. And that's his mother there standing inside in the shop as a model. And he has one of his also an early memory that he has that he one of his jobs to do on a Friday afternoon was to clean the butcher shop, and he had to, because he was a young boy and small, he had to reach behind the counter to clean between the counter and the window. So he grows into a family that is very hardworking. After they owned this shop in the Bronx, they moved afterwards out to New Jersey, and they had a poultry farm, which Segal afterwards continued to support and work very hard with his parents. His parents wanted him to go into science, of course, or to be a doctor, which he did start in the beginning of his career. He went to a more technical school and studies, and only later on, he was just attracted to art, and he pursued an art education degree. So in the beginning, he started off as a painter. And think about it, this is in the 1960s in New York. It's the high time of abstract expressionism. We see that Segal was not totally abstract. There's still figures, there's still some resemblance to real life, but on the other hand, it's pretty flat. It's not something that we can see shading or, a whole model. There's something very expressive about his work. And he used to teach quite a bit in order to support himself. And he says that his first encounter with plaster happened because a student of his approached him and said, "Listen, I have these plaster cloths." Yes, his family were part of a company that manufactured these cloths with plaster on them. Would you like to try some? Like, would you want to try this as a sculpture material? And this is the first sculpture that he did of himself. And you can see it's pretty rough surface. And it's a very simple position. He took himself, he used these bandages, and I'll explain a bit more soon how it actually works, and created a sculpture of a man sitting by a table next to a window and waiting. So there's something very simple, right? This is a situation that we all can recognize from our, day-to-day life. This was done in the 1960s, so he's not holding a mobile phone in his hand, but it is a situation that we all know, just sitting at the table. And he's using real furniture for it, right? He's using things that he found objects in his studio. Later on, he makes a bit more sophisticated. He's using other people as his models. Usually it's people that he knows. And he's taking more situations from day-to-day life. He says that these are things that he encounters in just riding a bus, And he knows that other people also can recognize and find themselves in this situation. But when you take an everyday situation and take it out of context and put it into a museum, something else happens, right? We recognize the context differently. We see the situation from outside. Maybe we can even look at ourselves in that from a different angle. We're talking about the 1960s, 1970s. So these are the other artists. This is what's happening in New York in the same days, right? This is the height of the pop art, okay? And all of these artists have some, have something in common with George Segal, because they're also using everyday life. But these artists usually use the objects themselves. If it's a brand, if it's an advertise, if it's things that we are like consumer, these are consumer items. Segal, on the other hand, even though he is part of the, you can recognize him as part of the pop artist area, he does not take the ad, right? He does not take the consumer factory. He takes the person themselves, the people themselves, and he places them in this world where we have, as you see here, advertising, where we have brands, where we are living in. So he's more of the existential artist, pop artist, and not because he's using ourselves within the work and not taking something just to that we recognize from our everyday life. So this is a sculpture of Times Square in 1970s, and in the background there's a real, usually a neon lights. And you see, this is in a museum. So it's a real life figures that we encounter when we walk around the gallery. And he says, I pay an awful lot of attention to carving out the shape of the empty space in all my pieces, okay? So it's not only the object itself, it's also what's happening around it. I pay attention to composing, stacking pieces, putting the stuff together, and my solutions vary depending on what I'm trying to say, what I'm talking about. It's literal cubism for me. So he's taking these different pieces, right, of the human being, of the elements of the structure, and he's sculpting them together according to what he wants to say. And here he's referencing in a lot of impressionist work, and we can see it's even placed next to another window, which is done very nicely, of somebody waiting in a window, which we can all recognize again, but it's also in talking towards other artworks that encounter the same thing. I think this is probably the sculpture that Mark referenced in the beginning, and probably many of you also have seen. And it's in New York City, in downtown city. The gay liberation sculpture was actually created many years beforehand, but there was a lot of controversy towards placing the sculpture itself in the village. There was objection, et cetera, et cetera. But today he has many sculptures, outdoor sculptures, where he took the same casting elements that he used to do in plaster, but then afterwards he cast them in metal and he paints it white. So it's a very similar effect. And you can see again, it's people, everyday positions, sitting on a bench, and you can sit next to them, you can encounter them. And there's something very strong about the fact that you can meet somebody else, another human being, physically, but your encounter is a bit different because they're static. They're an object. Of course, there's another memorial that he created, Holocaust Memorial in San Francisco. I haven't visited it. Maybe you have, and it seems to be very strong. He lost a lot of his family, his parents' family, in the Holocaust. So he has something very personal about this element, this sculpture. But I am not going to go further into it since I feel like we won't have enough time, because I want to focus on this. I want to focus on his process. How does he create these sculptures? So a lot of time he chooses people that he knows. And this is because he wants to feel easy with the person, with the situation. He wants to feel like he can control it and he can convey his message, or he knows the person, so he knows how he's going to behave in this situation. And then he uses these plaster cloths and he covers them up on the body, on the clothes themselves, piece by piece. And you can see all the pieces assembled behind him, maybe things that he discarded and not going to use, but he uses the different pieces and then puts them together. And he says, it's a pleasure to stumble on a material that in sculpture can refer to every kind of texture, every kind of experience, in the same way that oil paint is infinite to its possibility. It can either be paint or it can be an illusion of any surface. So also here, he feels like he found his material, okay? He found something that can really express what he wants to do in art, what he wants to, the message that he wants to convey. This is very, very different from a classical sculpture, okay? Because if we think of classical sculpture, we know that we take the material, it could be stone, it can be marble, and we carve out of it the sculpture. And here we have a picture of Rodin, or the master of modern sculpture, right? Augusto Rodin. You sculpt out of you carve out of the stone of the marble, okay, in order to create the sculpture itself. And you take the model and you look at a model and then you copy it, right? You want to bring it to life. You want to create something that is closest resemblance to the real life. But Segal, he says, for me to decide to make a cast of a human being broke all of the rules of fine art. Why? Because he is not taking necessarily the model and trying to copy it. He's taking the model itself and casting it. So there's a very big difference. And this is the process. You can see these are the plaster cloths. Maybe you've seen them because you use them usually, let's say if you need a cast on your arm or any other body. So they're cloths that if you cut them up into different pieces, into smaller pieces, you could just dip them in a bowl of water and then you shape them on your skin or on whatever you want, and it dries up relatively quickly, okay? On the left side, you see the more traditional way of creating a sculpture, and that is you have an object that you create, okay? Or here it's an apple, and you create a mold for it, right? It's usually the mold is made out of plaster, okay? And from that mold, you can have you can cast inside it from iron or any other material that you want to use. And then the mold, you take it apart and you have the positive. So there's a positive and a negative. Here, Segal is taking the negative and using it as the sculpture itself. So we can see here, there's a picture of Segal taking I think it's a hot dog stand. It's a sculpture of a hot dog stand. It's a friend of his, okay? And you do a piece by piece. And he says about choosing his figures, he says, I usually know generally what the emotional stance I'd like to have in the finished figure. And I ask the model to stand or sit in a certain way. That model, though, is a human being with a great deal of mystery and totally locked up in the figure. Okay, so he's using the model, gives instructions, but the model itself also has a place. This is important when we go and we think about our sculpture, the sacrifice of Isaac. And when I went into the research towards the restoration of the sculpture, I went to our, let's say, archive in the museum. And if you've been to my lectures before, you always will see this slide, because this is like my basis of a lot of my researches starts here, which is called the file, the work file, okay, Tiki Tzira, the work file. In it is all the information that has been collected over the years about the certain work of art. So it can be receipts from shipments, it can be letters, it can be articles, it can be registration notes, it can be condition reports. Whatever that is around is gone into this file. And when I came to look at the file, I saw this notice where it said, it's like a invitation from the Tel Aviv Foundation of Literature and Art, where they say that they invited George Segal to create a sculpture for the Tel Aviv Foundation. Together with him, they also asked Kenneth Nonold to come around also to create it. So there's two big sculptures on the way. And we know that he came in the winter of 1973 for the first time to Israel to visit as a prep. He came and he met the people, he saw the landscape, and experienced the culture, and he was really in awe of the landscape, the hills of Jerusalem, which he visited for the first time. And he used, as you see, the stone that we can see that we're familiar from the landscape as the base of his own sculpture later on. He met the people. 1973, the people were still talking about the 6-Day War and how the tables turned over and how everybody was expected to be wiped off. But in the end, the ending was better than it was hoped. And I do not want to make too much of parallels of what happened today to us in 1973 and then in October 7th. But then he went back to the States, and he says that he was engaging with the Kierkegaard's book called Fear and Trembling, while he was thinking about preparing this sculpture. And this is, you can recognize, first of all, what is on the cover of the book, what Penguin Classics decided to put on the cover, and that is, of course, Caravaggio's Sacrifice of Isaac. And the whole book is about the philosophical idea of the point where Abraham was willing to maybe put aside his ethical norms or feelings towards the religion, the beyond the reason and logic, in order to proceed with his faith, and how we take this willingness to sacrifice everything, even your own happiness, in order for faith. And Kierkegaard is really the father of existentialism philosophy. And while he was creating this sculpture, this is what was in the back of his mind, this paradox, this feeling of everyday horror that could happen. Before he went back to Israel to create the sculpture, he met up with Kadishman. Okay, this is who we see here on the right-hand side. It's a bit of a later photograph, but you can see George Segal together with Kadishman. And Kadishman, I'm just reminding you, is the artist that created the sculpture that we saw in the beginning in the hostage square, okay, just in front of the museum, and we're going to come back to it. And he asked Kadishman, who was a sculptor himself, an artist and a friend, to be the Abraham in his own sculpture, because we know that he uses real friends for his models. And Kadishman remembers, and he said, I was Abraham and my son Adam was Isaac. George had a great difficulty finding the right position of the arm waving the knife, a position that would express the strong opposition of the father, who was ordered to raise his son to the Olam. So think of it, how Kadishman, together with George Segal, together with this existential thought that they had about what is this act? How can God ask from Abraham, from somebody to sacrifice his own son that he's waited for and expected for so much? And how did Kadishman feel when he was standing there with a knife in his hand, and his own son was lying on the floor behind. And he said, I was kind of a chubby kind of Abraham, and my son, who was lying on the ground, was Isaac. I held a knife over him that we bought in some restaurant in Jaffa, and I felt bad about it. Okay, his son at the time was 9 years old, was a young boy. And there's also interviews with Adam. His name is Adam. He's an artist himself today. And he also remembers this situation being very uncomfortable. But maybe this uncomfortableness is, George Segal uses uncomfortableness on purpose in order to get the right position of Abraham, holding the knife in the right hand, but the knife is not aimed towards Isaac. He's holding it, and the blade is towards, not facing Abraham, but facing the back. Now, this is a photograph that I found in that file where I can see the process, where we see George Segal himself, and what he's creating here, we see the legs of Isaac, and he's using a net, a chicken net wire, in order for the base of the sculpture, and then he uses the plaster around it. Now, when this was exhibited for the first time in June 1973, okay, it received quite a lot of publicity and articles and journalism, and George Segal at the time was already quite a well-known artist, and it was a big thing for the Israeli art world, art scene, to have a sculpture of George Segal, for him to be around. But also there was a beginning of thought about criticism about how can you express the sacrifice of Isaac in today's Israel. And this is still before the 1973 war happened. But once the war broke up, it was even more extreme, and the sculpture itself did not stay in a public viewing for very long. It was, in 1973, it was donated to the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. And 1979, it was exhibited as part of an exhibition of European and American pop art. And then later on in 1983, it was loaned to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem for an exhibition. And that's why we saw in the photographs in the beginning why the sculpture itself was cut in half. Because it's 10 feet wide, it does not go through any door, or it does not go on any truck. So they had to cut it in half, or even it's 3 parts, in order for it to be commuted, to travel to one museum to another. So it did have it wasn't on constant display in the museum, but the Israeli public did get to see it. Not as much, probably, as Segal wanted it to be. And he says, in 1980 in an interview, I got a request to make a sculpture and to donate it to the state of Israel. I said yes. 2 weeks before I got to Israel, I got a fat letter asking for my plans, drawings, and blueprints, because it was to be passed by a committee. I sent them a light letter explaining that I never do that. I don't make plans. I don't work it all out. But the title is Abraham and Isaac. I got a telegram, either change the subject or change the site. I was furious. They were censoring me before I'd even started. Then I got a second telegram saying it was okay, come and do what you want, where you want. I discovered that Abba Eben's wife, Susie Eben, yes, had heard about this and was horrified about the censorship, and she read them to Riot Act. I did the piece, but it never got publicized. I was censored, and I was consigned, to a basement somewhere. I put my spice work and found that the Israelis were reading the piece as a criticism of Zionism, as saying that Israel was sending its sons out to war to die. And then he says something very interesting. I don't want single-handed, single-level art. I work very hard to pack in a lot of levels. Those bureaucrats weren't willing to read the piece as a detached philosophical examination. They were interpreting it on a simplest political level. So when he created the sculpture and when he exhibited it, he was thinking about the biblical story. He was thinking about the philosophical level of Abraham in front of his son and in front of God. But he was not, and I'm sure he was also thinking about the realistic levels of today, but he was not expecting it to be so, as he says, single-handed. And that's maybe why it was not, I can't really say, but it was not treated like he would like it to be treated, like George Segal was treated around the world through his sculptures. Now, before I move on to explain how we went into the conservation process and program and how did that all happen, I want to share something else with you. And that is that Segal created another sculpture called The Sacrifice of Isaac. And I don't know how many of you have seen it in the Jewish Museum of Art in New York. And it's a very different sculpture of Sacrifice of Isaac. We can see here that, first of all, Abraham and Isaac in this painter, Isaac is older and Abraham looks younger. We can see the most strongest thing is that here Isaac is really let's say waiting for the knife to meet his heart, and Abraham is ready to do the act, right? Now this sculpture itself was created as a memorial for the Kent University events in 1970. There was a there was a demonstration, an anti-Vietnam demonstration on the Kent campus, Kent State University's campus in Ohio. And during that time, during the demonstration, 4 students were shot down by the state police or the security. 2 were demonstrators, 2 were just civilians passing by. And the university asked George Segal to create a sculpture in memorial for this event. But once he created the sculpture, and we see that here, it's very difficult to say that Segal does not have a more political reading to it, because it was created in the intention from the beginning as a memorial sculpture. And when he presented it to the university, of course, they saw it as a great criticism to what happened there and to the state. And it's a state university, so it was a great criticism towards the state itself, as a sign of the slaughter of young people that happened. And they refused to receive it. They refused to actually buy it from Segal himself. And in 1979, it was sold to Princeton University, and that's where it exhibited today. So we can see maybe in the Sacrifice of Isaac that we have in the Tel Aviv Museum, he can try, or Segal says that he didn't want it specific to be read on a political level. I think in this Sacrifice of Isaac, we can't ignore it at all. Now, if we go back for the last few minutes, I'd like to just dedicate to explain how we, what the restoration project was, because it was not an easy sculpture to renovate. As I said before, the material is very soft, very delicate. It was in very bad condition. And it was a very big project to undergo for the museum. Luckily enough, Bank of America every year provides grants to institutions around the world for conservation. And we applied a few different projects to the Bank of America, different things that the Tel Aviv Museum wanted to participate, to receive a grant for. And luckily enough, they chose a project that I suggested, and that was the Sacrifice of Isaac. So this was a great help because the budget part, which is always a struggle in a museum, especially in a small museum, for conservation was a huge red light for us. And once I had a budget dedicated from an outside source for the conservation, I knew that this project can go ahead. So here we have a picture of the base of the sculpture. First of all, we have to make a very clear assessment of the sculpture, how its construction today, how it was, and then slowly the conservators of the museum, and here we see Dr. Asaf Granot and Ron Granot, people that work every day with different materials, starting a long process about how they can create this sculpture that will be able to exhibit and then store and last for many more years. So it was done in a three-step process. First of all, photographed from all over just to have documentation. It was very important for us, the documentation. We didn't have any, as I said. We only had a small black and white picture of it, so there was a huge documentation. And then the first part is stabilization, just to make sure that whatever exists won't fall apart. So that is creating a reinforcement structure of wire and plaster underneath the base. Then we built a specially fit, let's say, structure to go underneath with wheels in order that it could, moved around. And then, and this is a very, let's say, a technology that really high-end technology that we took into the art conservatory world, and that's the 3D mapping. We created a 3D mapping of the base in order that we can create a structure underneath that will be able to support it and be able to move it around. So the whole sculpture was a 3D scan, the base and the figures. And then you see here, this is like a skeleton that was fitted exactly underneath the base. And then it was flipped over. So we know that that would be stable. And then the wheels were added, okay, in order for it to be to move it, that we'll be able to move it from one place to another with the minimal effect on the sculpture itself. But it still had to be in two pieces, okay, because it still didn't go through a regular door, even a wide door, okay. So the sculpture is in two pieces, and then once they bring it together, we bring it together. These are the different conservators that were working on the project. The crack is filled in with plaster, and that could be removed and put together when it needs to be exhibited. So this whole thing took at least 2 years, and it was led by the conservative team, our chief conservator, and it was a long process of, first of all, research, and then how to apply the work and how also to make the sculpture last for many more years. And this is how it was exhibited in September 23. Apart from the sculpture itself, which now you're very close to and you know all about it, also in the background, there was a video. And the video is of the sculpture of Kadishman. And Kadishman is not only here as Abraham, but also as the sculpture that created the sacrifice of Isaac in 1982. In 1982, Kadishman made his own version of the sacrifice of Isaac, but we see it's a bit different because if we're used to having the leading figures, Abraham, Isaac, and the angel, we have different figures here. We have Isaac on the floor. We have the ram acting as, is he the angel? He looks like a kind of mean angel. Is he the father? Is Abraham here at all? He's not in the picture anymore. And who are those two figures on the right-hand side? They're not in the story. They're not in the biblical story. Who are they? Those are the women. Those are the mothers, okay? Mourning the loss. Because in Menashe Kadishman's sacrifice of Isaac, Isaac was actually slaughtered. He was not saved by the ram. He was not saved by anyone. So Kadishman is telling a very different story. And he proceeds with this in many, many of his works from 82 afterwards. He does the ram, he does Isaac, and he says the sacrifice of Isaac is not a symbol for me, sorry. It's a part of my biography and part of my generation's biography. So it's a very powerful and very meaningful sculpture for many, many Israelis, especially people who have been through a very similar experience. And we can see that he's sometimes changed it around, and the ram is on top, and Isaac is on the bottom. And if you visited the Jewish Museum in Berlin, you have all of these crying out Isaacs that you walk on, okay? It's part of, that's how he continued his artwork. I'm just going to end, and I know that we have 2 more minutes because I cannot resist to show you a few more examples of the sacrifice of Isaac in Israeli artworks. Because as Kadishman said, and that's why it was so important for me to create this renovation project of George Segal's sacrifice of Isaac, because this story is such an essential story within the Israeli culture, not only in plastic art, not only in art, it is in plays, it is in poetry, it is in legends and stories. There's something about this situation of the sacrifice of Isaac that is very identified by many different generations of Israelis. And here, this is a painter called Abel Pan, the Tzalel painting painter. He did also a lot of biblical themes, but his, when I saw this first, I had tears in my eyes because there's something so emotional, so tender by the fact that the father is kissing his son and the tear in his son's eye. And then also to know, if you read his biography, that he lost his son in the Independence War. So there was something also very personal about it for Abel Pan. I'm not sure how much you're familiar with Israeli art, but this is a more recent, maybe, artist called Gershuni, and a lot of time he appears saying Yitzchak, Yitzchak, okay? It also is Yitzchak from the sacrifice of Isaac, but it also has maybe more connotations to Yitzchak Rabin, and there's a lot of, it appears a lot of times in his work. And a recent photographer, well, the series isn't so recent, but it's an amazing interpretation of the sacrifice of Isaac into our modern life. It's a photographer called Adines, where you can see a father leading his son. There isn't a ram, there isn't an altar, there isn't an angel, there isn't a knife, but it's still the scene that we can recognize from the biblical scene that we can recognize. So here I am, just to sum up and to say there is no other biblical story that has taken such a root in the soil of Israeli art, as I said, not the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, not the struggle between Jacob and the angel, not the Tower of Babel. None of these struck so stubborn, so demanding into the Israeli culture. And it's amazing to see that today, yes, when we think and look at the Hostage Square, this sculpture that has been in place from 1982 is playing another role, is playing another story within today's scene. So I'd like to thank you. Thank you for being with me. And I hope the next time we meet, we will have better news to share, and the Hostage Square will not be occupied anymore. Bezat Hashem. And thank you. And if there are any questions, we have a few minutes, or just to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Is there anything? Let me open the chat.
Thank you to those of you who gave comments that weren't really questions, but really, really appreciate it. It has been a pleasure hosting you, Sophia, and we will look forward to the next time we can see you. Thank you for your contributions, and be strong. We're all with you.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Thank you.
Yeah.
See you next time.